I welcome you to this, which is our 6th College of Humanities and Social Sciences Community Lecture. I'm Ron Klein-Knecht. I'm Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And I'd like to say just a few words about our college and about this series before introducing Dr. Koetje, tonight's speaker. We as a college are a relatively new structure at Western. We're in our 4th year as a college structure. And when we set up and set our goals a few years back now, one of our goals was to try to make closer connections between our college and the community. And that's one of the reasons for this particular lecture series, so that we could bring the expertise and knowledge of our faculty up at Western to the community. Now, we believe very strongly that one of the functions and really responsibilities of a public university such as Western is to provide education for our community. And this is one of the ways in which we are trying to do that. So that is why we are here. We bring one of these lectures to the community every quarter during the academic year. So we'll have 3 of these each year. So we have the one tonight on 250,000 years of Neanderthal life. We have another one coming up that will be on the characteristics of several brain disorders, including schizophrenia and Alzheimer's disease, and this will be given by Dr. Janet Finley, who is in the psychology department and the neuroscience program. We'll have another one later on in the spring, from the history department. Dr. Chris Friday will be talking about some local history, Bellingham, Whatcom County history, and how he and his students have been documenting and recording a variety of things in history, including the history of GP, which they've done a large documentary project on just this past year, because we know it's on its way out. So stay tuned. If you're interested in these, stay tuned for those. Those of you who signed up down here and gave us your email address will receive an announcement of those in the mail. We'll have an email postcard such as the one that you see here. This is a postcard we sent around already. So if you've signed, or if you'd like to on the way out to be notified of future ones, that will make sure that we get those to you. Well, now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Todd Koetje, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Western. Dr. Koetje received his PhD in Anthropology, Archaeology at the University of Tennessee in 1989. He's a relatively local guy, having received his bachelor's degree from the University of Washington with distinction in 1983. Before coming to Western, he was an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He has served as associate director of the St. George Russian American Archaeology Program since 1995, and we'll hear about some of the results of that relationship this evening. He's published several book chapters and articles on his findings and the methodology that he uses for his findings at Weasel Cave and studying the Neanderthals, and we'll be hearing about that directly. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Koetje.
Thank you, Ron. I'm used to just talking in a big room like this, so they've got me mic'd up. We'll see how this works. When we talk about Neanderthals, everybody has their own interpretations of Neanderthals and Neanderthal behavior and what Neanderthals were like and how they were related to us. Those interpretations have changed over many years. As usual in anthropology, Gary Larson often sums up interpretations very well. Here he's got a Neanderthal's horoscope. You have a small capacity for reason, some basic tool-making skills, and the use of a few simple words. Yep, that's you, all right. Okay. And that sums up how a lot of people look at Neanderthals and have looked at Neanderthals for a long time. There are other contemporary interpretations. This is my personal favorite. This is Franz Frazetta, a fantasy pop artist from the 70s. It's maybe a little more violent than necessary, but actually when you look at the depictions, and you'll see from some of the skulls, he's not really far off, at least in terms of facial features and such things. When we talk about Neanderthals, though, what I want to do is start at the beginning. Okay? So, it's 1856. There have been no Neanderthals discovered until now. But in a limestone quarry in Feldhofer Cave in the Neander Valley in Germany, they found this guy, the top of a skull. In addition, they found some long bones, especially a femur and some other bone fragments, but this was the one that really caught everybody's attention. It was, at least arguably, human. And what the folks who found it did was exactly the same thing that people who find stuff like this do today. They wander into my office and say, what is this? In this case, I wasn't around, so they went to Johann Fuhlrott. He was a local schoolmaster and an amateur naturalist. And Fuhlrott immediately recognized that these were human bones, but that there were also some peculiarities to them. He also recognized that he didn't have the expertise to deal with it. So he took them to this guy, Hermann Schaffhausen, and said, what are these? He and Schaffhausen later on in the next year published their finding, and that started a bunch of controversy right away. The next guy to play was this guy, William King, an Irish geologist who looked at the bones and looked at where they were found and argued, unlike Fuhlrott and Schaffhausen, that they had to be old, they had to be from the Pleistocene, from the Ice Age, and that they were different enough from regular human bones so that they deserved their own species name. And so he's the guy that coined the name. And he called him Homo neanderthalensis, which means Neander Valley in German, Latinized. This was both completely normal in the sense of this is what naturalists and geologists and anatomists and biologists and people who were in those kinds of sciences did. They recognized things, defined them, named them. That was their job, so to speak. But it was also really radical because he was the first guy to propose not only that there should be this new species, but that it should be in this genus, Homo, our genus. Until he proposed this, there was only Homo sapiens. We were all alone in that genus. This is the first guy to propose and make that proposal stick, that there should be a brother species or a cousin species in our genus. Okay? And that created big problems for the way that Europeans in particular were thinking about the world around them. Because there were some fundamental issues here. Are these bones from a human, in which case maybe they do belong to the genus Homo, or are they from an ape? How can we tell? They're not us, that's pretty clear. If they're an ape, or if they're some kind of human, are they our ancestors maybe? Or is that impossible? They didn't know. It's 1863 when this happens. In 1859, just 4 years earlier, Darwin had published his book on the origin of species. So these two things were tightly connected. If they're apes, how come they seem so much like us? How come they're not like the other apes that we have examples of at that time from Africa? And then there's my favorite interpretation, and the one that became dominant towards the 1900s, that these were not apes, they were not our ancestors, they were just regular old people, but they were diseased and, in the parlance of the time, degenerate. Just people who lived in caves. Like you could live in a cave and become a Neanderthal someday. So today when we look at Neanderthals, we see things very differently. And yet, a lot of those questions still sort of echo down the years, and we still have trouble answering some of them. In many ways, it's this question and this specimen and this series of questions that define the beginnings of what we can call paleoanthropology, that study of human ancestors and other kinds of related fossils. And rapidly after 1863, when this species got announced, other people found Neanderthal bones, or bones that could be classed as Neanderthals, and some of them they found they had actually known about for nearly 100 years, but had put in boxes and ignored. So very quickly, there were a lot of Neanderthal specimens in Europe, and it was clear this was a coherent group, not just isolated bones in a cave. Today we know that specimens we can definitely call Neanderthals show up all the way from Europe to Central Asia. And in fact, just last week, there was an announcement that some people were looking in China at bones that they think might be Neanderthal as well. So it could go even farther east than that. We also know that we have skeletons that date from right around 150,000 years ago, for sure, down to almost 28,000 years ago, for sure. So these folks have been on the planet, or had been on the planet, for about 125,000 years. That's at least as long as we've been here, if not a little bit longer. If you're willing to be a little fuzzy about exactly what's a Neanderthal in terms of biology and skeletal characteristics, you can push those numbers back to maybe 180 and down to maybe 23,000 years ago. So this is a very successful species. We've been around for quite a while. It also turns out that William King was probably right. He suggested that the original Neanderthal specimen had to be old enough to be in the Pleistocene, the Ice Age. We now know that all of them are essentially from that Pleistocene time period. And in Europe, that means we're dealing with a cold or a very, very cold climate. Okay? This slide shows you just reconstructed global average temperatures over the last 219,000 years or so. The magenta bar down here is the time period from which we have Neanderthal skeletons. This bar up here is the present climate, essentially. Notice that it's all colder than it is now, and considerably colder, except for this one little chunk of time here, about 5,000 years or so, when things were just a little bit warmer. But all the rest of it is colder. In Europe, that means northern Europe and northern Eurasia is essentially covered by glaciers. And even the temperate parts of Europe, France, southern Germany, Spain, are very nasty, cold environments. And that's where these guys lived for 125 or 150 or maybe even 200 or more thousand years, and successfully. So let's take a look at some of these specimens so that you get some notion of what they look like. This is Gibraltar 1, it's called. This is actually one of the first Neanderthals that was ever recovered. It was found in 1820, but nobody noticed that it was particularly different. They put it in a box and ignored it. It's pretty classic in the sense of Neanderthals. Big eyes, a huge nose, large teeth, a very projecting face, a very low, you'll notice, skull, with very little forehead, and very big brow ridges. Here's another one. This is from the side. This is called Laferasi 1. Same kind of characteristics. Cheekbones that slope back, brow ridges that protrude, not much of a forehead, certainly compared to us. The whole skull is quite low and very long compared to ours. Okay? That's fairly clear even if your only vision of a human skull is the Halloween version. There's no big high forehead here at all. It's sloping back. It's quite distinct. It looks a lot like Neanderthal 1, in fact. Here's the skulls sort of fleshed out. No hair or anything, obviously, but Neanderthal up here, again, that long, low skull, protruding brow ridge, big nose. That's probably their dominant feature. If a Neanderthal walked in and sat down next to you, you'd probably say, that's a pretty ugly guy, and he's got a huge nose. But you're not going to look at him and say, you're not a human. And in fact, this reconstruction here has always looked to me a lot like Vin Diesel. But that's just me. Here we have the whole skeletons put together and scaled so that they're the same height. Okay? What you see here is, when you look at Neanderthals, notice how big and thick and robust the pelvis is, how wide the hips are, how big the bones of the arms and legs are, how broad, and it's harder to see because it's depth in this picture, but how deep the chest is. It's a big barrel-shaped chest. These are thick-bodied folks, especially compared to a modern human scaled to the same size, okay, or the same height anyway. Now, when we look at Neanderthals, we can see very clearly these guys are very heavily muscled, without any question, compared to us, for example. In some cases, the long bones of the arms and the legs develop a curvature because of the heavy musculature. That's a normal response, the way bones grow when they're under stress. We can see they have this big barrel-shaped chest. We can see they have relatively short limbs. We can see that they're short as a group. About the largest adult male Neanderthal that's ever been reconstructed stood about 5'6". They seem to average right around 5'5" or so. Not dramatically short compared to our population, but definitely on the short side. Female Neanderthals as adults were probably no taller than 5 or 5'1". And they're relatively heavy for that height. Now, we're a little worse at estimating weight than we are height, because you have to really reconstruct the musculature a lot more thoroughly. So 160, maybe 200 pounds, but only 5.5 feet tall as an adult male. Pretty chunky guys, but not Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's 6'5". All of this is classic cold adaptation. And that's not surprising, given where they lived. Okay? Short bodies retain a lot of heat compared to tall, thin bodies. If we look at other kinds of things we can see on the bones, a really good example that's important to understand behaviorally and is also important historically is this specimen. This is from a site in France called La Chapelle-Sainte. This was found about 1905. It became, at the time, very celebrated because it was the most complete Neanderthal skeleton that had been recovered, and many people looked at it and tried to reconstruct what Neanderthals were like as a group. What we can tell when we look at this guy, and you can see immediately probably, is that he was in bad shape in many ways. This is an old individual. This is somebody who's probably at least 45 years old, maybe upwards of 50. He's got some pretty serious indicators of a skull fracture. He's got some serious indicators of a variety of possible bone diseases. He's got a whole bunch of injuries, broken bones, and those things all healed. He's also got, you can see right here, very serious periodontal disease. Brush your teeth, floss. This guy didn't. That's the sort of thing that in a society without antibiotics kills you. You die from infections. This guy didn't die. He lived with all those injuries and very old. This is not a robust young man who jumps up and grabs a spear and goes out and hunts a mammoth. This is a guy who hangs out at the back of the cave and stays warm around the fire. And he did that for a long time. And somebody took care of him through serious injuries, through serious periodontal disease, through serious arthritis. Just about every joint on this guy's body that you could have arthritis in, that we recover, he's got arthritis. And some of it is so bad that it's actually bone-on-bone contact. Okay? Very painful, nasty stuff. And yet he survived. Somebody took care of him. They took care of their elderly. That's pretty clear. And this is one of the first times in human prehistory that we see good, clear evidence that that's what's going on. This is not just some guy who died and is a pile of meat that they got rid of. This is somebody they took care of through injury and through other kinds of situations. They fed him, almost certainly. He doesn't have very many teeth left. He's not going to be chewing on mammoth steaks here. And they buried him when he died. First time that kind of thing happens. So Neanderthals in many ways look like they're behaving like us, not like previous groups. At least to my mind, that is a pretty good indication that they've got culture and civilization, if you want to call it that, in our sense of the word. No buildings, no skyscrapers, no airplanes, but they're thinking about things, at least at a basic level, like we are. Another thing we can look at to understand their behavior and their culture is the tools that they made. Okay? Neanderthals made a particular kind of stone tools that are called the Mustarian culture, named after this site, the Mustarian stone tool culture. Okay? The Mustarian stone tool culture is something that's fairly complicated and elaborate. There are about 67 distinctly recognized stone tools that belong to it. Those stone tools are usually well made, reasonably crafted. They're not perfect and beautiful, maybe, but they show a fair amount of skill. They usually take on very standardized forms, and those standardized forms last for almost the entire time period that we're talking about. A 200,000-year-old Mustarian stone tool looks like the same type made 30,000 years ago. So they were in a little bit of a rut. They weren't terribly creative, maybe, but they knew how to make their tools, and they made them. Even more impressive, they knew several different ways to manufacture the same tool. And it's not uncommon to find a single site where you've got several different manufacturing processes going on to create the same form of tool at the end product. That's design. That's somebody who wants that shape and that form for that use, whatever it was exactly, and knew how to get it. That's not a random accident. It's not little kids goofing around. It's not just breaking a rock. That's, I want this. That's, I want a Phillips head screwdriver, and I know 6 different ways to make one, and I'm going to use them all when I want it. That works pretty well. So I'll just show you a couple of them so you can get a feel for it. One of the more impressive ones to my mind is called a Kina scraper. It's named after a site where they were first recognized. It's got bifacial retouch on it. That means retouch on both sides, on both surfaces. The retouch is little teeny flakes taken off the edge to give the edge a final shape. So stone tools don't ever picture very well, but we're talking about this edge here. And you can see there's little scallops from those little flakes off. Here's my sort of bad drawing of it. It's called Kina retouch because the retouch scars from taking those little flakes off look like they overlap, like fish scales or roof tiles. Okay? That's happening on both sides, and they're doing it so that if you looked at this in cross-section right about there, they're doing it so that they create a particular edge angle that's useful as a tool for scraping or whittling. It's not useful for cutting. It's not a knife. It's for doing particular things. So they're using these techniques to achieve that edge angle on that tool in that shape. And this particular kind of retouch is invented about 140,000 years ago and lasts right down through the end. So a good example of design. Probably the most famous Mustarian tool type is the hand axe. These are actually pretty rare, and they're actually very small too. I have one up here. That's a real one. It's kind of big. It's probably not finished. Most of them are only about as big as the palm of my hand, and they're usually very nicely made like this. But they're in no way, shape, or form an axe, even though we call them that. You can't hold these in your hand and chop down a tree. They're sharp all the way around. You'd cut your fingers off if you tried that, first of all. So it's a very useful knife, and it's a very useful kind of general tool, but it's in no way an axe. They also knew how to look at a piece of rock and recognize that they could see a shape and a final form in that rock, sculpt it, and then take that final form off so that it was the shape they wanted. They did that through the use of what's called the levawa, or shaped core technique. Okay? What you're looking at here is the top of a core, the bigger piece of rock. This is the end product, the flake. And what they did was shape the top of that rock by taking flakes off here so that they could take this one last flake off, and it would be that nice triangle. And it would have naturally sharp edges. Okay? That's the final product. It's usually called a levawa point or a Mustarian point. That requires you to look at that rock and see that shape and know how to get there. Okay? That's not just breaking a piece off and then trimming it to a final shape. That's imagining it in the rock. Again, design. These are people who are thinking about it. Here's one from Weasel Cave. Same kind of thing, a lot bigger. They trimmed and shaped the core and then took this final flake off. Okay? Same exact technique. That's also been around for a very long time. Another part of Neanderthal culture that we can look at that tells us a lot about how they behaved is burials. because it turns out they buried their dead in at least some places fairly extensively. One of the best examples of this comes from this site, La Ferracie in France. I showed you La Ferracie 1, that's one skull from that particular site. This site was excavated originally in the 1920s by a man named Denis Perroni, who was one of the better French archaeologists of his era. He reported 6 burials at La Ferracie. It's a rock shelter that dates to about 65,000 years ago. One of those burials had an engraved capstone over it, and I'll show you a drawing of it here in a second. Another one had a very large ribboned flint or banded flint, a very pretty hand axe in it as a grave offering, perhaps. And they were all associated, they were all dug down from the same surface, and on that surface there was an associated group of mounds that were built in a geometrical arrangement. Okay? This is not extensive engineering, but it's certainly well thought out. This is Perroni's original plan map of La Ferracie. This is the back end of the rock shelter here. These are where the burials were found, and here's the geometric arrangement of mounds. The most interesting one of these is number 6. This is the one with the capstone. Here's the plan view. Notice the burial itself is triangular. The block on top of it is a piece of limestone. That's also triangular. This kind of limestone doesn't break naturally in triangles, so that had to be trimmed into a triangle. In addition, it had what Perroni called cupules on it. That's little cup-shaped depressions. It's not clear whether those are natural or whether they were man-made or whether they were natural and then enhanced by people. Perroni argues that they were engraved, essentially, by people. It's not clear when you actually look at the rock, but there's certainly some evidence of grinding. And then when you look at the burial itself in cross-section, it's also a triangle. Pretty well thought out. Here's La Ferracie 2, also a burial. This is one of the better pictures we have, which is not very good, but you can see the outlines of the pit that he's buried in. There was red ochre, which is a naturally occurring mineral pigment scattered over the bones in that pit. And it's fairly clear, here's the upper leg bones, the lower leg bones of the foot, the head, one arm, another arm. This is a guy laying on his side, curled up like that. Okay? Again, a burial. They're paying attention to people who die. If we look beyond that kind of thing and look for direct evidence of what we can call art and symbolism, or symbolic behavior, or however you want to express that exactly in the Neanderthal time period, it's easy to summarize. It's relatively rare, and it usually occurs very late in the Neanderthal time period, if it occurs at all. Generally, when we find symbolic behavior going on with Neanderthals, they're things like we saw at La Ferracie, the geometric arrangements. There's some engraving on rock and arguably on bone. And I'll show you a picture of some of that here in a minute. In fact, almost all of it that exists. The cupules on that block at La Ferracie are some of the better examples of the engraving on rock. There's sometimes chevrons and other cut marks on bones that seem very, very deep and don't seem to be butchery marks from butchering an animal, but seem to be intentional. Every once in a while, especially towards the very end of the Neanderthal period, you find pierced teeth as though they're designed to be hung on a necklace or attached to clothing. Usually they're fox canines, but in all there's only 3. And then there's a new phenomena that a couple people have found in a couple of different places relatively recently. The French call them masks, some people call them faces. I'll show you a pretty good example of one here in a second. Red ochre, a naturally occurring mineral pigment in burials. That's it. This slide shows you just about, there's actually 3 more, all of the engraved bone from the entire Neanderthal time period. That's it. That's all the art that occurs on bone. Okay? Clearly, none of it is depictive, unless you want to argue that this is depicting something. If you can figure out what it is, you're better than I. Okay? Most of it is just deep grooves. It's possible that these are tally marks or calendar marks, or they could be many different things. It's also possible they could be musical instruments. If you deeply groove a bone and you rub another bone against it, you get a kind of a musical, almost a percussion instrument. That's possible. Many possibilities, but not very often. But then every once in a while you get things like this. This is also from France. It's from a site called La Roche-Cotard. It's a naturally occurring piece of flint with a hole naturally occurring in it that's been flaked. It sure looks like that flaking has enhanced its sort of triangularity. Okay? And then it's got a piece of a reindeer rib shoved through that naturally occurring hole. It's very hard to argue that that's a natural occurrence. And it's very hard to argue that it doesn't look at least a little bit like a face. And in fact, in many ways, it's got kind of a big brow ridge and a big nose. It looks a lot like a Neanderthal face, maybe. Okay? And there's a couple of these kinds of things. Most of them are a little bit vaguer, even. This is the best example of it. So certainly, we can argue they were recognizing people and faces. We can also argue that maybe they had some kinds of musical instruments. Okay? This is a little out there, but this is, at least purportedly, a flute. This is a fragment of a juvenile cave bear. It's got two holes in it that are very clear, right here, and two more at the ends that are broken off. If you reconstruct those holes, they're about the right size and shape for putting your fingers over, and if you reconstruct them properly and you blow air through it, you get a Western diatonic scale. So maybe they were flute players. We also have some evidence from other places in Western Europe, and these are kind of scattered around. They occur in 2 or 3s in a couple of places, a couple of different caves. Horse and especially horse, but also bison ankle bones, astragalus bones they're called, can be broken in such a way so that they're a little bit hollow inside, and they'll emit a really shrill whistle when you blow over that hole that you've created. Again, this does not seem to be something that's accidental, and it doesn't seem to be something that's predominantly natural, associated with Neanderthals. So maybe they're music players. Okay? In many ways, when we start looking at this, given how sophisticated we know they are in terms of making stone tools, given how they're around for a long time, given how they're taking care of their elderly and their dead and their diseased, it's kind of surprising that they're not making more art and symbolism. That's something that we do all over the place. Modern humans make art and symbolic expression pretty much constantly. It may be that what we're dealing with is partly a preservation issue. If they were doing things on leather, say, or skin, or bark, or things like that, we would never find that, because those things are simply not preserved. They could also be doing things like painting themselves or tattooing, where they could have really cool hairstyles. Hard to tell. We're never going to recover that, almost certainly. They could have really cool clothes, too. Again, hard to tell. But it's an interesting lack. If there's one place where they seem to lack our kinds of patterns of behavior, it's this. And that may be filled in by preservation issues, or may not. It's hard to argue from a negative, certainly. Okay? So, that's background. Weasel Cave, now where I've been working for the last 10 years or so, is in the southern part of what's now Russia, in a little independent republic called North Ossetia-Alania. It's about as big as Whatcom and Skagit County combined. It's next to, or not quite immediately next to, but the more infamous independent republic Chechnya is just to the east of us there. Georgia's just to the south. Ushtalagti Lagat is Weasel Cave in Russian. This is my secret Soviet map that 10 years ago I couldn't get out of the country because it was illegal. It shows Soviet secrets like where the hills are. Here's Weasel Cave. Here's Vladikavkaz. That's the big town, the capital of North Ossetia. This map is important because it shows you a couple different things. First of all, this river gorge right there that goes right through Vladikavkaz, that's the Terek River. That's the only pass through the Caucasus that's open more or less year-round. Historically, it's been incredibly important. If you're going to get from the south to the north or vice versa through the Caucasus, you're going to go through there. End of story. There's no other way except to walk around the mountain chain. Historically, that pass has marked the boundary between Europe and Asia. That's the Iron Gates of Darius that marked the northern boundary of the Persian Empire in classical antiquity. Very important place. Very important for a couple of other reasons. If you stand on the tops of these hills and look north, except for these smaller little hills up here, and they're very small, there's nothing between you and the Arctic Ocean that's any significant terrain feature. There's a couple rivers you have to cross. Everything else is flat. It's the Russian plain. If you go north out of there a little bit and turn left, there isn't anything between you and Europe and the Atlantic, except the Carpathian Mountains, and you can go north around those through Germany. If you go up a little bit from here and turn right, there's nothing between you and the Pacific except the Ural Mountains, which are fairly small and have lots of passes through. So you get through those mountains and you have the whole northern hemisphere open to you easily. Okay? That's got to be important, my way of thinking, about in the context of how modern humans, or anybody coming from the south, is moving into the northern hemisphere. And here we have Weasel Cave, not on that gorge, but the one right next door. Good stopping place, maybe, if you're halfway through or something like that. So we have big hopes for what's happening at Weasel Cave. This is the terrain, not far from Weasel Cave. This is just to the north of us. This is very typical of these sort of series of ridges and foothills that lead up to the higher peaks. What you're looking at is limestone that's been block faulted and uplifted, and the talus slope in front of those cliffs where all the erosion has dumped stuff as the cliff erodes backwards. Just in this little picture, between this cliff and this series of cliffs over here, there are 15 known cave sites that have not been explored except to go in them and say, yep, it's a cave site. Those are just the exposed ones. We know also underneath this talus slope, because the cliff was originally farther up and it eroded back, underneath that talus slope, those are where the really old caves are. And you can't get to those without doing a lot of digging. So the area is full of this kind of stuff. Here's Weasel Cave. This is our American Spy satellite photograph, we call it. It's not really. I'm taking it from the ridge on the other side of the little valley. But you can, in fact, see the new roof, which you're looking at here, on some satellite photographs. It's kind of neat. This shows you the cliff that Weasel Cave is part of. Here's the actual cave itself that's present now. Here's the part that we're excavating. Largely, it's in the talus slope outside of the actual cave that exists now. You can also see the block fault here that exposed the cave, which was a hollow chamber inside the cliff. That block fault happened, the cave got exposed, it was open, then people could inhabit it. This is looking back from Weasel Cave to the ridge that I was standing on when I took that picture, and it was right up there. In fact, this is late September. It's already started to snow there. The people in North Ossetia believe that the mountains have we can call it a god, a spirit, a presence, something. The name for it that they have is Washtagi, which they connect right up directly. And there's some pretty good scholarship that suggests that this is a good, solid connection with St. George in fact. Traditionally, Washtji is portrayed like this, as a face, or as a guy on a horse with a spear killing a snake, which is just exactly how St. George is usually portrayed. But those portrayals of Washtji go back to the Bronze Age in this area. So they predate Christianity and they predate St. George. So maybe this is St. George, I don't know. But at the beginning of the excavation every season, every year, they sacrifice a sheep that we later spend a week and a half or so eating, so it's not wasted. But this is our beginning of the year sacrifice to Washtji. This is Weasel Cave as I first saw it back in 1985. 1995, sorry. They had just suffered a major roof collapse, and what you're looking at here was their quick effort to repair that and protect the excavations. They're trying to build new towers for the new roof, which later collapsed. So now we're on the third iteration of a roof. In the winter here, about mid-January, there can be as much as 3 or 4 meters of snow on the ground. So when they build a roof over something, they have to build it very solidly. And some years, it doesn't work so well. This is from the inside. Sorry, let me go back. So here's the existing cave. Here's the excavation area, and this big scalloped out area is the talus slope that we're digging down into. Okay? This is standing inside the existing cave looking out. This shows you how complicated the geology here is. You're not talking about a cave that's like a railroad tunnel that just goes straight back into a cliff. This is a cave that's a series of big chambers, and the chambers have different openings in different directions, some of which connect up to other chambers, some of which are windows or skylights, we call them, some of which are doors that come out onto the surface. And by all indications, the cave was always like this, a series of these interconnected chambers, sometimes completely sealed, sometimes with skylights, sometimes with one entrance, sometimes with multiple entrances. So it's very complicated to excavate. I know there's a lot going on here on this slide. It's hard for me to figure it out sometimes. Don't worry about it too much. What we're looking at here is a profile view of the large excavation unit. So down here is the very bottom. This is about 36 meters below the existing opening of the cave up here. That's a little more than 100 feet. And there's a 6-foot-tall guy for scale here. That's how big the deposits are. Here's a plan view of the same thing. We're looking at this large area here. That was in that profile. That's the area that's roofed over. That's Weasel Cave. This area over here is another entrance to a chamber that's kind of underneath Weasel Cave. So the floor of Weasel Cave makes the ceiling of this chamber. We call it Dormouse Hall. Okay? But they're connected. What you'll see here at the very bottom is down here in the very deep units, there's another opening, and we think at this point, we haven't been able to connect the two, but we think that's the lower opening of the chamber that we're calling Dormouse Hall up above. So there's at least 3, we can call them sort of stories. There's the existing cave, there's Weasel Cave that has collapsed, and then there's Dormouse Hall underneath it. Okay? All of them could be occupied simultaneously or separately. Just depends on how many people were there. Just some orienting shots. This is from about 1982 when they were beginning to excavate. So you can see the beginning of the excavation here. This is the existing cave. Here's a couple guys for scale eating lunch. Some of these big roof fall blocks are about as big as a Volkswagen or so. Most of the older deposits are underneath those. Those represent the original ceiling of the Weasel Cave chamber that's collapsed. So we have to get through those and remove them before we can actually dig. Here's what it looks like inside some of those chambers. This is a really good shot because it shows you some of the contrasts that go on. Here's a layer that is a very nice thick sediment layer with lots of stone tools in it. That's layer 14, you'll see more of that later. On top of that, layer 12, a big pile of rocks. That's a roof fall episode. That usually represents a very, very cold snap where the roof has collapsed. Here's again the beginning of the excavation up at the top. Another shot of another piece of layer 14. that we'll look at later. This is between two of those roof blocks in the original excavation, so we're trying to get down in there and see what's there. Here's another shot of part of the upper area. This is, again, layer 12 here, layer 14 underneath it. Again, you can see the big roof fall blocks. Obviously, a really cold period when the roof was collapsing in a major way. This is from me again. This is the first year that I was there, looking down into that big unit that's open. I'm looking at it from the other side. Here's Sergei for scale. And a really important marker horizon here, this big gray layer. That's a layer of volcanic ash from Mount Kazbek that erupted about 500,000 years ago. Right now, it's about 1 meter thick towards the outside of what was the original Weasel Cave chamber. Originally, that probably would have been about 2 meters or so of ash. It appears to have come down more or less at one point in time, not subsequently, not episodically, but all at once. And then it was compressed by geological forces. So it was a devastating event, very clearly. A major eruption. It killed lots of things. You can't survive 2 meters of volcanic ash being dumped on you. This is from this September. Same place. I'm looking down into the deep unit. Here we've got the new roof with all the beams and stuff. Here's that gray ash layer. The floor down here is actually not the bottom of the unit. We've filled it back in with sandbags like this to protect it, because what happened was we got too deep and the excavation became too narrow, so we had to fill it back up, protect it, and step the sidewalls back so they wouldn't start collapsing on us. Okay? So we're in that process here. Right here is layer 14 along the sidewall exposed. It's kind of a reddish layer. See it again here. That we're excavating down through because it's a very dense layer, and then we'll step that wall back eventually as well and open this up even more. If we start from the bottom now and kind of work our way up, down in that very deep unit, back in 2000, at 36 meters below the existing cave, we found this little crack. We called it, a little bit apocalyptically, maybe the third gate. Pretty cool. This is sediment over here. This is rock. This is how we initially recovered it. You can see we put a little light in there, and one of the crew was in there digging it out at great hazard to himself, in fact. A couple years later, this is what it looks like. You can see it's the edge of the actual cave, a new opening that goes up that way. And here's that sediment. Layer 18, the ash layer, is up here. Here it is from a larger perspective. Again, here's the edge of that rock. Here's layer 18. There's layer 36 down in there. At this point in time, we think that, we don't have confirmation of it, but we think that layer 36 down there is magnetically reversed. And that makes it probably, not for sure, but probably about 780,000 years old. So between layer 36 and layer 18, we think we've got about 400,000 years or so of deposit. Now that's before there were Neanderthals. And in fact, when we recover artifacts, we don't recover Mustarian artifacts. We recover things like this. This is an Acheulean hand axe, not a Mustarian hand axe. It's much different, it's much bigger. It's made of very different raw material. Nothing like what's used for tools later on. The people who made this were probably Homo erectus, or maybe even an earlier form, not Neanderthals. So at the base, we have these non-Neanderthal folks. The next level up that's got a significant occupation in it, that has lots of stone tools and animal bones, is layer 14. And this is the chunk of it that we're working this last September. You can see it's just a narrow little strip. It turns out to be from here to there, just about 13 meters long, though, but only about 1.5 meters wide. In that little strip, and about 50 centimeters deep, call it 8 inches or so, there were about 15,000 stone tools and animal bone fragments. So a very deep, a very dense occupation. Now, this would have been occupied when the cave itself was intact. So this would have been in the sheltered area. This is not out in front of the cave or in the open air. This is in the cave. It's just that now that original cave has collapsed. Here's a good example of a surface that we think we can recover. This is probably, it's not exactly, but it's probably an original occupation surface that people would have walked around on. All of the lighter stuff you can see here is animal bone. It's broken up into small fragments. This is mostly deer and Caucasian goat. There are occasional fragments of bison, though, which don't live in the mountains. They live out on the plain, and that had to be brought up. And then the darker sort of bluish material, those are stone tools. It seems fairly clear right here, and we're in sort of a narrow crack between the sidewall and a rock that's over here. But it seems fairly clear that what we've got here is a place where somebody was, at least as we reconstruct it, sitting on this rock, where I've got the letters, and making stone tools, the debris from which went over here, and breaking up animal bones, the debris from which is sort of around that. So we've got what we think of as an activity area. Now, is that actually a preserved surface that is exactly like it was maybe 125,000 years ago when somebody left all that stuff there? Very hard to tell, but it sure looks like it at this point. And that's the kind of preservation we get in bits and pieces in this cave. You don't get big, large surfaces because the cave itself was like I showed you at the beginning. It's got this weird topography inside of it. The normal floor of the cave is this rough surface. It's not a flat surface at all. Right? And so you're only going to recover things like this in small pieces, in fragments. If we shift up to the next really dense occupation, this is also Neanderthals and the Mustarian. This is layer 11, but it's layer 11 not in Weasel Cave, it's layer 11 in Dormouse Hall. It's off to one side and it's this separate chamber. This is not a Neanderthal. This is a former student, Garth Baldwin, who came to Weasel Cave and worked for 2 years. He's at the very top of a hearth deposit in the layer 11 here. You can tell he's not a Neanderthal, he's got a beard, right? All the Neanderthals we have didn't have beards, or at least all the pictures. If you look here, you see a whole bunch of white dots. Okay? Those are not artifacts, those are the markers that we use to designate the artifacts, because what we try to do is excavate a surface, mark everything in place, and then come back and take a picture or draw a map of it so that we recover things where they were. Okay? So the white dots are cotton balls on the ends of pins. But here you can see bone, here's some ash, and some of those darker spots are charcoal. Here's a close-up of it. Charcoal scatter, a lot of the dark blotches. Here's a little wood ash. Another close-up, here's that rock. This would have been just inside the entrance to the cave. So it's just in the sheltered area of the entrance. The drip line, the place where the rain would have fallen off the edge of the cave, would have been out here another couple feet. And we can see that in the sediments. It's very clear. Somebody built a fire here up against this rock. Even more interesting, that rock, if you'll see, is smooth. It's not jagged and broken up. That comes from weathering. That means that rock was outside the cave. Somebody brought it in the cave, built a fire against it, used it maybe as a reflector or maybe as a place to put their back, something like that. Hard to tell. But they definitely brought it in from the outside of the cave. It's not the way the rock naturally breaks in the cave. We found lots of things around this little hearth. This is a cave bear canine and a vertebra. It's always tempting to say, oh, this must be ceremonial or ritual or something like that, and maybe it is, or maybe it's people goofing around. You've got some cave bear vertebra and some canines laying around, and why not play with them? So maybe it's Neanderthal kids. Who knows? But surely it's not a dead cave bear who naturally put his canine on his vertebra. We also get some stone tools. This is a this is a core that was found right next to the hearth, just outside of the actual burned area. Next to that, a scraping tool right here. And outside of that picture, one of those triangular tools that I showed you that is made using the Levallois technique, a Mustarian point. Classic Mustarian kinds of stuff. And we found lots of this, in fact, in this layer. These are some examples. You can see it's a little easier to see them sometimes when they're drawn than when you're actually looking at them. The light's a little better. Very classic Mustarian tools. When we look at some of those under a microscope and look at the wear on the edges, we can actually figure out what they were used for. So this is a Mustarian point. It's not that one that I showed. This is from layer 10, just above that. When you look at the edge right there, under 200 power microscope, you find this shiny spot. That's been identified as wood polish. That comes not just from rubbing that edge on wood, but actually slicing and whittling. In addition to that, right here, on a ridge on the natural surface of that flake, is the same kind of polish, wood polish. Okay? But that's not a sharp cutting surface at all. That's a flat surface. That's been identified as what it's called here, hafting polish. That's when you put a wooden handle on this tool, and as you use the tool moves back and forth in that haft, that handle, because you can't get it really tight. And that's very classic. And in fact, most of the Mustarian points that we find at Weasel Cave don't seem to be used as projectile points, as spear points. They seem to be used instead as hafted knives, put in a handle and used for cutting wood. Here's another one. This is from the same layer. Almost exactly the same kind of thing going on. Wood polish on the edge, hafting polish on one of the ridges on the back. Again, the same kind of thing. Very different than what we expect when we look at those, and especially when we hear them called something like a Mustarian point, you think immediately, oh, it's got to be a spear point or an arrow point or something like that. No, it's a knife, apparently. Not a point at all. But if you think about it in terms of the form, what's the difference? A projectile point, a spearhead, an arrowhead, a knife, they're all really very much the same thing, just used for different purposes. So maybe it was also a spear point, but they also used it as a knife. A different way of thinking about tools than we're used to thinking is kind of the important point here. Now, if we move up again and we look at the upper deposits in Dormouse Hall, we go to the next sort of dense layer. We're at the very top now. This is, in Dormouse Hall, this is called layer 4. This is in this little chamber right underneath the roof. So there's not actually very much room. You can't stand up between the current deposits in the cave and the roof anymore. Here you can see where we've cut down through these as you go into the entrance. And you can see this is layer 3 here, and then layer 4A, 4B, 4C, 4D, 4F, and so on down to layer 5. And they all have that same sort of arced shape to them. That's almost certainly because the roof is so low that as people are moving back and forth through this chamber, they compress the soil in the center where they're moving, and everything ends up with this arc shape to it. If we go over in this direction and look at layer 4B now and shift to outside Dormouse Hall, but look in through a window, through one of those skylight holes, we see this. This we started excavating 2 years ago. So now we're looking down through one of these windows onto the surface of layer 4B. This is also not a Neanderthal. This is also one of our students. Kirsten. She was with me there 2 years ago. And we began to excavate. That window that we were looking down through is right there. The profile that I showed you just a minute ago is right over here. So you can see it's a very crowded little spot. But it's an ideal spot in many ways because you could build a fire, you could have the smoke go out the window, you'd be close to the entrance, and you'd also be close to the rest of the chamber if you wanted to go back there. So in terms of a spot to hang out in, this is kind of an ideal spot. What we found here when we got immediately under the surface was the remains of a cave bear. But it's not a cave bear that died naturally, and it also doesn't look like it's a cave bear that was necessarily hunted. We don't find injuries on it that we can definitely say were due to humans. Okay? But the bones are arranged in an odd way. 2 long bones, lower jaw, vertebrae, ribs. Okay? This is not the natural order of a bear's bones. Because it has this kind of square shape to it, between the long bones and the lower jaw and the vertebra, we started calling it the square bear. You look more carefully here, you can see there's a lot of bear parts here, but there's also some interesting parts missing. We have the lower limbs from one side but not the other. We have the lower jaw, we have the whole lower jaw, the entire mandible, both halves, but we don't have the skull. It's gone. We've got the canines, we've got a bunch of the other teeth, we've got some of the vertebra, about half of them, we've got some of the ribs, about half of them, we've got none of the phalanges, none of the toe or finger bones, sort of half the bear, and arranged into a square. So it's a half square bear, sort of. Okay. Here's the lower mandible. This would be the left side. The only stone tool clearly associated with the whole bear is right there. It's in between the 2 parts of the mandible. Mandible was sitting on its side, and they stuck this small little cutting tool in between the 2 back ends of the mandible. This part of the mandible back here is where it articulates with the rest of the skull. That part is pretty fragmentary. The skull would have been naturally right here, but it's missing. Okay. We actually excavated that area, and there's definitely no skull and no skull fragments there. So it's been removed. There was a skull over here, but it was the skull of a marmot, not a bear. That's the only other animal bone that we've been able to identify clearly here. Everything else is bear. We can also see pretty clearly, and here's a close-up. This was a fairly old bear. The teeth are pretty worn. It's not clear, at least to me, I'm not much of a faunal analyst, whether it was a male or a female, and as far as I know, the faunal analysts haven't made up their mind yet. But it was a fairly old individual. Here's that stone tool. Here's the next layer down, so I've taken that part of the mandible off, and we're looking at the other half of the mandible. Okay, there it is. And as you go down a little bit deeper here, you get more and more vertebra. Again, sort of piled up in that squarish formation. Here it is in sort of full-blown glory. See, here's various bits and pieces of vertebra. There's some ribs up here, but most of the ribs were over here. That's the critter we're talking about, okay? A cave bear. These guys were typically a little bit bigger than your average polar bear, so fairly large. Much larger than a black bear from around here, more like the size of a grizzly, or a little bit bigger than that. A fairly fearsome critter. They liked caves. That's why they're called cave bears. They apparently mostly spent a fair amount of their time in caves. They certainly hibernated in caves. It's fairly clear that people and cave bears didn't cohabitate, but they competed for empty caves. So have we got a bear that's been hunted and killed by people? or butchered by people, or have we got a bear that naturally died and whose bones were arranged by people? No, we don't have any clear indication one way or the other. Obviously, they were arranged bones, but did they kill the bear, or did they just find it dead, or did they find it dead somewhere else? Again, not very clear. But remember, half the bear isn't there. The other thing that's going on right in that same spot, so we're just a little bit to the north of where the bear is. Here's that big flat rock. Right here you can see, compared to everywhere else where all these rocks are sticking out, there's some orange streaking and there aren't any rocks. That's a little hearth. It was actually cut in half as people excavated down through it before they recognized it. So when we got there, we could see it, and you can see it's a little basin-shaped deposit right there. Close-up of it. And you can actually see the burning and manganese staining on these rocks that form the bottom of that basin. In fact, when you look carefully, there's 2 episodes of using that hearth, not just one. These rocks form the bottom. There's a break right there, and there's relatively solid material here, and there's relatively ashy, more broken up material below it. It sure looks like the hearth was used once, maybe cleaned, and then used again. And this is more or less in direct association with that cave bear. As we excavate this whole thing out, one of the things that becomes clear is you can trace some of that ash and charcoal out to where the bear bones are, and they appear to be sitting essentially on top of that surface. So we can connect the bear bones up with that first use of the hearth pretty clearly. Here we are looking down on the top of the hearth. Here's that cut we were looking at. Here's that blackened rock. Okay, so I've taken out a little chunk here, and right there is the outline of a bone. It's very badly deteriorated. We could not, in fact, recover it as such. So we can't take it back to the lab and identify it clearly. The faunal people who were there say it's not unlikely that it's a bear bone. It's certainly consistent with it. Okay? And that would help confirm that idea of the bear being in direct association with the early use of this hearth. This black stuff here is charcoal, or we thought it was charcoal. We actually took that as a possible dating sample. Turned out that it wasn't charcoal. It's manganese. There is no charcoal in it. So we could not get a good radiocarbon date on this hearth. It was distressing. But here's the very bottom of the hearth. Bone. And here's when the hearth is essentially gone. I've taken the whole thing out at this point. So we're just looking at the rocks that form the basin here of the bottom. Here it is from the side. So you can see here are the rocks that form the bottom of that hearth. And back over here is where the cave bear sits. But things get even odder. Underneath that hearth and the cave bear, which seem to be pretty clearly connected, not very far underneath it, about 10 centimeters, are these 2 pieces. And I know they don't look like much, they look like rocks in dirt, and they are, but they're quartz crystals. Not something that occurs naturally in the cave, something that had to be brought to the cave from somewhere else. Where, we don't know exactly. They're about that big. So they're big chunks of quartz crystal. They're not perfectly clear, like the crystals you'd buy in a crystal shop or something like that. They're a little frosty, but they're very distinct and they're very unusual for the time period, and they're right underneath the hearth and the bear. Even more peculiar, and I don't have a good shot of this in place, not far from the hearth, and just about at the same level as the quartz crystal, okay? But in that same basic area, we found this. This is the top of a bear skull. It's clearly in layer 4B, in the bottom of layer 4B, so it's associated with all this other stuff. We don't know whether it's the same bear. It looks like it's probably not. It looks like it's not a really old individual like the bare bones that we have suggest, so it may be another one entirely. But when you start looking at it carefully, when you look at these edges, it's been cut. That's not a natural break. This is somebody who cut that bear skull. Whether they cut it off the bear, doesn't look like it, but they certainly sliced that edge. And when you look at the other edge, it's the same thing, also sliced. They were making something out of that. Now, when we look at it, it's easy to hold it in your hand and say, oh, it's a cup. Maybe they were drinking bad red wine out of a bear skull cup. Or maybe not. Certainly, what's going on is they're cutting bear skulls. Okay? Very, very unusual. The whole thing, in fact, is very unusual for the Mustarian, not something that you typically see. But in many ways, it's in line with the kinds of things that you see in bits and pieces in the Mustarian. It's that almost symbolic expression. We've got a bear that's arranged in an odd geometric pattern, but only half of it's present. We've got a bear skull that's cut. Very unusual for the Mustarian time period in Neanderthals to do anything like that. We've got quartz crystals. We've got a hearth. We've got this odd little place in the cave where you can sit around a fire and look out the entrance and have a skylight above you and have everything in the rest of the chamber behind you. It smacks of, in many ways, it smacks of ceremony or ritual or something like that. And it's very tempting to say that, to say, oh, this must be some kind of interesting religious ritual. But then you have to ground yourself again and realize that, these are naturally occurring objects that are there that anybody who is inhabiting the cave can pick up and mess with, essentially. And so is it ritual? Or is it Neanderthal children playing with toys that happen to be available? Hard to tell. Very hard to tell, in fact. They're competing hypotheses, if you will. But if you were a Neanderthal child and you had a bear and some bare bones to play with, if your kids are anything like the Neanderthal kids, you know exactly what they'd be doing, playing with the bones. And maybe that's what's going on here. Maybe we're tempted to interpret it as ritual when it isn't. On the other hand, maybe it's ritual. But it's very peculiar, very unusual. And the combination of the place and the material and the hearth and the cave and the time just make it very, very strange and very different when you start thinking about Mustarians. So we think we've got a pretty neat place here. Last but not least, this is the surface immediately underneath all that stuff. Okay? This is the rocks that they would actually have been setting up on. The hearth, the cave bear bones, the skull cap was over here. The quartz crystals were over there. So this is the natural surface of the cave as they found it probably initially when they walked in to the bottom of what we're calling layer 4B. Now, at this point in time, we don't have a good date for this. We've tried to collect samples multiple times to get radiocarbon dates. We've got a couple of radiocarbon dates, but they're sort of all over the place. It's not clear when these things date to. Probably we're looking at the very end of the Mustarian Neanderthal time period, so I'm guessing somewhere between 25 and 30,000 years ago. But one of the radiocarbon dates is 13,000 years ago, so kind of all over the place. It's almost certainly not really 13,000 years old in terms of this layer. We think that's a bad date or a date on a piece of charcoal that came from somewhere else, but it means that we can't tell. We can certainly say it's the end of the Neanderthal Mustarian time period, at least as we see it in Weasel Cave. And the interesting thing about that here is that once Neanderthals disappear sometime after 30,000 years ago, more recently than 30,000 years ago here, nobody takes their place for about 10,000 years. So modern humans don't come into this area. In many ways, this looks like it was kind of the last place where Neanderthals hung on up in the mountains in the northern part of the Caucasus. And when they disappeared, even though there were modern humans all around them at that time, No modern humans came into this area. Okay. Kind of lends to the aura of mystery here about what's going on at the very end. Okay. So that's Weasel Cave.